morning, everybody. I have to say that I'm very pleased, honored, and also humbled to be speaking about this issue on which, I see many more people who are clearly more knowledgeable than myself about it. So it's a privilege to be here. Now, Francisco's presentation was rather compelling in a sense, that it didn't leave much room for dissent. So if the question that we're saying globally is inequality increasing everywhere, then you've made the point that it's not. And I agree. I mean, there's nothing to contest when it comes to the Ginies and based on the evidence that you showed. But I don't want to linger on into that debate. I want to take the debate to the regional level. So what I'm going to try to do is to discuss some of the issues that you raised, but from a different perspective, from a perspective that basically tries to combine what's happened to people's welfare, what's happened to the middle class, what's happened to poverty, to vulnerability, and then touch upon the issue of inequality. So as you can see, the conventional wisdom is that most people everywhere are better off. And this is what you see here. This is basically poverty distributions or distributions of income across different thresholds of poverty lines, if you will. So this is basically the share of the population that lies below 50 cents a day, all the way up to $10 a day in 1990, okay, for the different regions. So that dotted line is the Middle East and North Africa, and you can see here, for example, in 1990, around 80% of the population is earning below $10 a day. That's the same story in 2005, and what you can see is that there's a downward shift for almost all regions. Of course, it's not so noticeable for South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but we know that these are the regions where you've had less of poverty reduction. But the phenomenal decline in poverty for East Asia is also quite noticeable. So what this story is telling us, there are a few things that we can conclude here. One is that we expect, a lot of poverty reduction to have happened based on, this is basically based on povcal.net, so it's the same data set that you're using. It's based on PPP levels of household surveys, consumption and income aggregates. But when you look at the Arab region, you'll see that it's the only region that intersects with the global average, okay? So what does that say? It basically says that if you're in the Arab region and you're thinking about the poverty story, well, it depends. If you use the 1.9 as your benchmark, then clearly we're not, very poor compared to the global average, whether it's in 1990 or in 2015. But if you move above a threshold of like $4 to $5 here, you can see the world total after $6, we're actually poorer than the rest of the world. And that's the only region for which this happens. And so the story here, the first story I want to say is that poverty story for this region, not for any other region, but for this region, depends on your choice of the poverty line. Because that's my first key message. And this, of course, has implications that I may return to later. Okay, so based on this, then, we can expect that if there's been an improvement in poverty and reduction in incomes everywhere, we expect that you see poverty and vulnerability declining. And that's the case if we translate this arbitrarily. So, for example, if we try to split the the countries into within country distribution of extremely poor groups. And again, I'm using the 1.9 here as a benchmark for that. A vulnerable group that's basically between 1.9 and 3.5. A lower middle class that's between 3.5 and 7, and upper middle class between $7 and $10 a day, and then above $10 a day, which we call affluent. And then you look at the Arab region as a whole, you'll see, sorry, let me get back there. You'll see that you know, there's basically a huge expansion in the middle class, whether it's lower or upper, and in the affluent groups, along with declining poverty and vulnerability. And that's also the case in Egypt, which is the largest country. So that's the story that you get from the global numbers. Okay, that's very key here that you see. Now, where one can argue, you know, these are arbitrary measures. You know, why would you pick 3.5 as a lower threshold? Or that's something that we can discuss later, but it's based on our knowledge of the region. It's based on the equivalent of most of the national poverty lines estimations for the region. It's also based on work that we did in ESQA, which I'm coming to here. So this is the story that we have shown in the ESQA middle class report, in which we tried to do exactly the same exercise that I did before, but using national thresholds. So what you find here is basically based on the Revalian approach, on the World Bank approach. We've estimated poverty using the national poverty line, the lower national poverty line. Vulnerability using the upper poverty line. The middle class we have a definition for that we've introduced in the ESQA report, but it's not too difficult. It's basically if you have a family that spends on non-essential goods, an equivalent, a household that spends on non-essential goods, an equivalent of the value of the lower poverty line, then it's no longer middle class. It becomes an affluent. And so we use that definition to separate between the affluent families and the rest of the middle class. And the story here is basically, now of course there are comparability problems between countries, but we've tried to harmonize as much as possible the definitions by using the same, again, Revalian approach in measuring the middle class, the lower, the extreme poor, and the vulnerable groups. Basically, the story here is that in 2010, most of the region was considered to be middle class, around 47%. But due to a series of, you know, events after 2011, the political upheavals, the economic recessions, you see that in many countries you see rising poverty and vulnerability, and that's the case in Egypt. So the story, as we know, many of us here in Egypt, is one that gives you a completely different trend than the one that we showed earlier. So for example, from 2005 to 2015, poverty rose in Egypt from 19% to around 28%. If we go back to the same picture using the global definition, it gives you exactly the opposite. So again, this is not something that, you know, we want to get into, because that one is PPP based, another one is based on national surveys. But what I want to say is that this issue is very important, because it underlines the perception that Francisco basically alluded to in this region, that there is a perception that inequality is rising. Well, this perception is grounded in something, and that's it. You know, that when you do your poverty measurements using, and again, I emphasize the World Bank methodologies, you see a completely different picture. And it's not just for Egypt, by the way, it's for many other countries. And so that's the discourse that we're faced in this region. It's a discourse that, you know, maybe some people would say it's exceptional. So be it. We are living in interesting times in a very exceptional region. But we have to take that into account when we talk about inequality. So let me now go to the inequality issue, okay? So the first question is inequality between countries, between Arab countries, rising? And here is basically a quick, answer to that question. Probably not between the middle human development group, which basically is the largest population group, and the GCCs, and this group is basically the high income, which includes Libya, I think, and Algeria. But definitely when you include the low income and low human development and Syria. So I don't know, but probably the poorest, the gap between the poorest and richest and middle income countries in this region is growing. And we know why. It's basically because this includes Yemen and it includes Syria. It didn't include Syria before, but Syria is now basically in that group. So I would suspect that in this region, between income inequality is probably going to be right. But there are other, just intuitive examples that one can use to substantiate that claim. So for example, if you just look at the 42 on the Forbes list and look at their wealth compared with the GDP of the poorest country, you'll see that it's an equivalent order of magnitude. So 42 people have a wealth level that is equivalent to the annual income of people in the LDCs. So again, this region is different because we expect it to be different. We expect it to be different because we know that this is an oil-rich region. We know that we have governance problems. We know that we have rentier political economy systems. So we expect to see that kind of picture. Now we get to the interesting story, which is closer to what Francisco was talking about, that the Gini coefficients from the povcal.net are been declining. And we see that to be the case for the Arab region, whether you use the weighted this is the weighted, this is the unweighted, you see that there is a decline. We also see that for almost all the Arab countries, the levels of the Ginis are below the world average. So that's the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is that we have a region based on the Gini that is of low and declining inequality. Again, very much different than the picture that I showed before. But there's a caveat here, and it's a very important caveat, is that these Ginis are based on household income, okay? So, but economies have been growing at a much higher rate than is captured by household income, and particularly for the richer and middle-income countries of the region. Okay, so if you look at the gap, the growth in household income over the period between 1990 and 2015, and you look at it in Egypt, it was basically almost 40% or less, which is not bad. But if you look at the growth in GNI per capita, it's almost double that. And you can see the same thing in Morocco, you can see the same thing in Jordan. And of course, for the poorer countries, you don't see that gap. And so basically, the levels and differences between GNI per capita level and household income is large, and it's increasing. Yeah, Yemen is different, obviously, because you have the negative impact here of the crisis. So that's why you see it. But the difference is not huge compared to other middle-income countries. So what does that say? It basically says that there is a difference between the way that economies grow, between your national account story, and between the households story, which again is underlying all of the work that the Paris school tried to do. Now, where is this income going, this extra income going? There was an excellent article in The Economist last week which tried to allude to that. That's the big question. But one of the explanations that I think would be interesting to look at is that perhaps that with larger economies, you have less response rates, so by the rich. And that, as you can see, and I borrowed this from Vladimir, our colleague of Vladimir, is obvious here. So the point being that one of the reasons is that the rich tend to, in richer countries, are less inclined to take part of these surveys. So when you try to capture that missing income, as Piketty did from tax data, you can see that the story completely changes for the Arab region. Suddenly, we're not, the lowest inequality region worldwide, we're actually the highest. Again, interesting. For this region, I don't want to argue, that this region is exceptional, it's completely different, but based on these stories, that you get the differences, you can see that, no, there's something else happening here. Maybe that's the subject that we can discuss further on. But this is what I want to close with. It's essentially, basically, observations that we have in our inequality, Rethinking Inequality report, which, by the way, as Danielle said, and Daniela said in the introduction, is not mainly focused on income, and we're trying to address other issues in health and education. But for the income part, we're basically saying that we have two stories, okay? So one story tells you that household growth is good, based on the PPPs, the middle class is expanding, poverty and vulnerability are declining, inequality is low and declining. And you have another story that tells you growth is low, negative in the case of Egypt and some other countries, middle class is shrinking, rising poverty and vulnerability, and inequality story is rather gloomy with this high and rising within and between country inequality. Now, which one makes more sense? Obviously, that's the question that we can discuss. Thank you very much.